If you don't know what Ouija board is by now, you obviously don't follow spooky stuff, don't believe in Halloween, don't believe that you can communicate with spirits, and don't watch horror films. But for those of you who knew what Ouija board is, have you ever wondered where they came from or how they were built? Ouija board, also known as spirit board or talking board, is a flat board marked with the letters of the alphabet, the numbers 0 to 9, the words yes, no in the uppermost corners, goodbye at the bottom, and sometimes hello. Occasionally, it also comes along with a few other symbols and graphics for decoration or spiritual meaning. Accompanying the board is a small heart-shaped piece of wood or plastic called a planchette. The idea is that two or more people would sit around the board, place their fingertips on the planchette, pose a question, and watch as it moved from letter to letter, spelling out the answers seemingly of its own accord. The concept of people holding a device that points outwards from an otherworldly force is almost ancient. The use of a planchette-type device can be traced back to the Chinese Song dynasty around 1100 AD. The Chinese scholars of the Quanzhen school practiced a form of automatic writing called Fuji that involved using a planchette and contacting the spirit world until it was forbidden by the Qing dynasty. Similar variations of automatic writing to contact the dead took place all over the world in close circles over the next 800 years, until Ouija was combined with and popularized the practice. The Ouija board, in fact, came straight out of the American 19th century obsession with spiritualism, the belief that the dead are able to communicate with the living. Spiritualism, which had been around for years in Europe, hit America hard in 1848 with the sudden prominence of the Fox Sisters of New York, who then became celebrities as a result of the claim that they were able to receive messages from spirits. The movement also offered solace in an era when the average lifespan was less than 50. Women died in childbirth, children died of disease, and men died in war. So desiring communication with departed loved ones at a seance wasn't uncommon, and during the second half of the 19th century, spiritualism reached its height, and its adherents at this point of time are said to have been in the millions. Spiritualism gave rise to a group of people known as mediums. The mediums claimed that they were mediator between the living and the dead, and employed a number of techniques to convince their followers that they had such abilities. One of these was known as table turning, that involved the table moving or knocking on the floor in response to letters called out from the alphabet. Another method used planchettes, where users would place their fingers on the device, which would then be guided by spirits who would write messages. However, there were some serious problems with these two common methods, which purportedly communicated with the dead. The table-turning method, for instance, took too long for questions to be answered, and once the novelty wore off, people understandably became bored. As for the planchette, the writings that were produced were often too difficult or even impossible to decipher, and it was regarded as a rather ineffective device. As spiritualism had grown in American culture, so too did frustration with how long it took to get any meaningful message out of the spirits. Some spiritual mediums were unreliable, and it was expensive, as the spiritual mediums charged a lot to send and give a message. So, who invented the Ouija board? According to Robert Merck, the real history of the Ouija board is just about as mysterious as how the game works. In 1886, there was an Associated Press story about new talking boards taking over Ohio. One of the men who read this report was Charles Kennard of Maryland, and claimed to invent the board that would become Ouija. He asked a man who worked right next to him, E.C. Reich, a cabinet maker and coffin maker, to make a few. But Reich later on claimed that he was the one who came up with the idea, and that Charles Kennard took it from him and went on to make it a business, so we don't really know who did. In 1890, Kennard, along with 4 other investors, one of which was Elijah Bond, who in fact was mostly looking to open Americans' wallets, established the Kennard Novelty Company to exclusively make and market these new talking boards. The original idea was to turn the board into a toy, and the patent was granted in 1891. The boards were just called talking boards and were supposed to answer facts about the past and predict the future. Initially, it was supposed to be just a fun throwaway game, completely unrelated to ghosts or the occult, until American spiritualist Pearl Curran popularized its use as a divining tool during World War I. People then became convinced that the movements of the planchette must have an otherworldly origin, and they eventually became the go-to device that filled the public's desire for one-on-one home contact with the dead. And it was a money maker. By 1892, the Kennard Novelty Company went from one factory in Baltimore to two in Baltimore, two in New York, two in Chicago, and one in London. According to Ouija historian Robert Merck, contrary to popular belief, Ouija is not a combination of the French oui and the German ja for yes. Merck says, based on his research, Charles Kennard, Elijah Bond, and the other investors had a séance with Bond's sister-in-law, Helen Peters, whom Bond calls as a strong medium. The board was asked what it should be called, and the board spelled out Ouija. When asked what the word meant, the answer was good luck, apparently according to the ancient Egyptian language. During the session, Peters was wearing a locket with a picture of a woman on it. Above her head was the word Ouija. This might have been a misreading of Ouida, an author of women's rights activist whom Peters is said to have admired. The building where the séance happened still exists at 529 North Charles Street, Baltimore, Maryland, and is now a 7-Eleven. Kennard left the company in 1891, and the Kennard Novelty Company became the Ouija Novelty Company. And in 1901, Elijah Bond sold the company to one of his employees, William Fuld, and took over the talking board production. When Fuld took over production of the talking boards, he popularized the more widely accepted etymology that the name came from a combination of the French and German words for yes. The Fuld name became synonymous with the Ouija board as Fuld reinvented its history, claiming that he himself had invented it. Notably, William Fuld is not the inventor of the board, even though his obituary in the New York Times declared him to be. Fuld would go on to design many different versions of the board, and he holds more Ouija patents and copyrights than anyone else in history. A grand total of 21 registrations in 3 countries, including the design for the modern planchette. And because of the board's huge success, a number of competitors tried their hands at creating their own Ouija-like devices. Fuld sued many of those copycats right up until his death in 1927. He died in 1927 after a freak fall from the roof of his new factory, a factory he said that the Ouija board told him to build. He climbed to the roof of his 3-story factory to supervise the installation of a flagpole. When the rail against which he was leaning gave way, Fuld fell to the ground below. While being transported, a fractured rib pierced his heart and William Fuld died at the hospital. After his death, Fuld's children took over the company. Catherine and William A. Fuld ran the company until the youngest brother, Hubert, became president of William Fuld Incorporated in 1942. In 1966, Fuld's estate sold the family business to Parker Brothers, which manufactured the modern boards as we know them today. The first wooden boards Parker Brothers produced were well made, but then the boards went from hardboard to tightly pressed paper to cardboard. Now, the only wooden boards are made by individual craftsmen. In 1991, Parker Brothers was sold to Hasbro, which now holds all the Ouija rights and patents. I hope you enjoyed and learned something about this video. Please don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and of course, share it with your family and friends. Thanks for watching. Until next time.